Okay, and there we go. It is 7:03 p.m. Thank you everybody for joining on your Sunday evening, and congratulations on receiving your interviews at the Schulich School of Dentistry and Medicine at Western University, London, Ontario. Let's get started. My name is Kevin. I'll show you the introduction in a second. But today we're focused on panel preparation and your interview day. So as the Bright Doctor, we have webinars on a lot of parts of the process. So if you want our Casper webinar or anything else, just send us an email and we'll gladly send you the link. And a little bit about me. My name is Kevin. So I've been accepted to both Canadian and US medical schools. I applied 2 cycles. The first cycle I applied was only Canada, and I got 2 Canadian interviews. It was at McMaster in Ottawa, and I got waitlisted at both and then rejected at both. But then the second cycle I applied both to Canadian schools, and I got 4 interviews across different provinces. And in the US, I got 5 interviews. And I'm in the US. I'm at the Mayo Clinic Alex School of Medicine here in Minnesota. But I also got into Canadian and US schools. It's just I just picked the best one that was available to me. And the focus of today's presentation, by the way, I've seen like every kind of panel there is to see, every kind of MMI. So if you have any questions about international admissions or anything, you can ask me at the end as well, okay? So the focus of this presentation is the difference between great answers and extraordinary answers. And I'll tell you why that's so important. And this is, basically your panel is going to be 45 minutes on a variety of issues, and it's going to be synchronous. And you're going to be forwarded all these details, so I'm not going to bore you with them. But when it comes to these panel interviews, it doesn't actually matter. People think, oh, I have a panel interview versus an MMI. I need to take very, very different approaches to preparing for these. But that's not true. That is simply not true. Because your panel interview, from my experience, Canadian or US, will ask you like 80% of the same kind of ideas as those MMIs can. The only difference is, I think the MMI, the whole innovation was getting like a different interviewer for every question. So it makes it like less biased or whatever. So, you shouldn't be like, oh, that's an MMI resource or that's a panel resource. That's not good. You could be expected to know anything about any of these topics, okay? Opioid epidemic, homelessness, barriers to care. All of these topics are very important for you to study. And by the way, don't bother taking screenshots or writing this down. All these slides will be sent to you at the end of this presentation. And not only do you need to have knowledge on these topics, but you need to have the ability to provide an expert opinion on these topics, right? So it's not like, oh, mental health. Here are the statistics on mental health in Ontario. Here are the statistics on mental health in London, Ontario. No, you need to be able to provide an expert opinion. What are the problems? What are we doing? And what are the ways forward on anything and everything, okay? So the first time I applied, I had this down, actually. The first time I interviewed with Canadian schools, I had all of these topics down, all these medical-related topics. But here's what's different. You're not only expected to understand topics that are relevant to healthcare or medicine, but you could be asked about, like, housing in Ontario. You could be asked about cancel culture. You won't believe the number of interviews I've had where I've been asked about cancel culture. And I'm like, man, I just spent the last 2 months studying like organ donation, right? Like I just spent 2 months studying organ donation, and I'm being asked about cancel culture. I'm being asked about the wealth gap. I've been in Canadian interviews where they showed me a map of like the world and showed like the density of wealth in different areas of the world and just asked me to interpret it. Okay, so you could literally be asked anything and everything. And the second time that I interviewed with medical schools, this is the level of understanding I had prior to going into my panel or my interviews, right? The first time I was just like, okay, what's relevant to medicine? But the second time I started understanding everything. All right, what's my opinion on like the aging population? What's my opinion on cancel culture, recent bills, climate change, right? Climate change, that affects. And the beauty is, why do you need to know about like climate change? Why do you need to know about cancel culture? Because these are societal issues that affect everyone. And the second something affects everybody, it becomes a matter of public health. And public health is a huge theme in these interviews. So you're expected as a future medical professional, as a medical student in Canada, right? The cream of the crop who are accepted medical school, you need to have opinions not only on medical topics, but anything and everything in society. Be able to at least give a mature opinion, an expert opinion on it, okay? So take these two lists, and I would spend a lot of time with them just understanding facts and crafting opinions on these topics, because any of them could show up in your interviews, especially even if you have like one of those role play style bits in your panel. It could be about some person who doesn't want to get vaccinated, right? So you have to have an opinion, and it might come through in your interview in just a different way. So I believe the best way to learn is always to practice. So let's do a practice question together. Imagine you are a physician and you encounter a patient with chronic pain who requests opioid medication. How would you balance the need for effective pain management with the risk of opioid addiction? I'll let y'all take 1 second to think. How would you answer this question? Okay. Now let's go. Let's look at an answer to this question. I would conduct a comprehensive assessment of the patient's pain. I would have open conversations with the patient about their pain experience and treatment history. If opioids are necessary, I would proceed with caution, starting at the lowest dose to avoid dependence. I would revise the treatment plan with the patient periodically, which means I'd regularly review it and adjust as needed. And lastly, this interviewee could give a conclusion. So I want someone to unmute or just type in the chat, is this a good answer? There are things about this answer that could be improved. So in my opinion, this is a good answer, okay? This is like something that is a mature answer. It addresses all the points of the question. And it's something even a clinician could say, perhaps, right? But now let's look at this great answer. Let's see what else we could do. This great answer is something I would have said in my first year interviewing with Canadian medical schools. The second year, let's see how I would go beyond. Imagine you also said, I could first explore a multidisciplinary approach to treating pain. For instance, physiotherapy, lifestyle modifications, exercise, and diet. I would educate the patient about the risks of opioid use and how we can minimize these risks to build a trusting doctor-patient relationship. And what if we didn't stop there? What if we go even farther? We make connections. You can make connections to the opioid crisis. Every major metropolitan center in Canada and beyond, the Northern Territories, London, Ontario, are facing an opioid crisis. You can mention that in your answer. You could talk about interesting things like sickle cell disease and racism with respect to opioids. For instance, a lot of Black individuals, especially young Black men, come to the emergency room. They're in pain, maybe because they have sickle cell anemia. And this is something, it's a trait that's more prevalent in the Black populations because it confers, typically because it confers resistance to malaria. And they'll come into the emergency room seeking medication for their pain. And the ER doc, the emergency room doctor might be like, oh, this person just wants opioids. So there's stereotypes at play there. You could talk about that. You could talk about specific medical cases that are relevant to Canada or Ontario. You can briefly mention the science of opioid addiction, right? Maybe you took a class on cell biology, and this is a great place to, throw it a bit about like your knowledge of, okay, like opioids block reuptake of like norepinephrine. Obviously, that wouldn't be the main argument in your answer, but it could be a part of it. You can mention your knowledge of naloxone training, right? Maybe you've been in community projects, maybe you've been on the streets administering naloxone, providing training. These are all connections that you can make that will go help your great answer become an extraordinary answer. And this was a difference for me. The first time I applied and interviewed with Canadian schools, I would give these mature answers that would hit all the points of the question. The second time, I would go farther. I'd go beyond, and I'd give these extraordinary answers. And by the way, all of these questions and answers are coming from our website, thebrightdoctor.com. And this one in particular came from our opioid crisis question bank. So all these answers, along with ideas to go beyond, for example, you also could have mentioned using state prescription drug monitoring programs to track opioid prescriptions. Ontario monitors its physicians and how often they're prescribing opioids. It's called an opioid stewardship program because they don't want overprescription of opioids, right? You don't want to fuel another opioid epidemic. So All this information is there. And now why do we need to give that extraordinary answer? Why can't we just give a mature answer like the one you just saw? And it comes down to, there's what, 600 interviewees, but only 200, 150, 200 are getting in. If you consider waitlist movement, okay, maybe up to like 45% of people are getting offers. But all of you are incredibly smart and brilliant enough to get an interview at the Schulich School of Dentistry and Medicine. You have the GPAs, right? You did your MCAT, you have your extracurricular activities, and all of you are deserving of that spot. So the thing is, how do you stand out? How do you stand out? And the way you do it, and for me, what I started to do was, here's how I like to explain it. Everybody was like doing the same thing, and this was me the first time I applied and interviewed with schools. I would be doing the same things as everybody else, reading, doing right, listening to the same podcasts, everybody, going on CBC Health, going on healthydebate.ca. Everybody was doing this, and I look around me, right? My friends were interviewing for Schulich and whatnot. I'm like, man, if I don't read like healthydebate.ca, I'm not going to get into med school, right? Because they're going to say something in CBC Health that they read that I'm not going to say. So I was one of these people. But the second time, I started going against the grain. I'm like, okay, everyone is brilliant. Everyone deserves a seat at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. So how do you start standing out? And I'll show you what I started to do that would make me completely different. Now, the 5 ways to stand out in your interviews, in your panels, MMIs, I really boiled it down to this. You're either going to address more perspectives than others, which means you demonstrate more knowledge, for instance. You offer more alternative solutions than other people, and these are usually creative solutions or how to avoid certain issues in the future. You're a better speaker. Maybe you're more personable, you have a more organized answer, less ums and ahs when you talk, and you look at the camera and you speak with confidence. For example, I can tell you right now, the average length of a giraffe's neck is 20 feet. And you'd have no reason but to believe me, but I just made that up. So you can look at a camera and speak with confidence. That is very important. Make connections to your personal life. So for instance, the opioid question we did, it could have been, okay, in my personal life, I have done like street medicine programs where I've administered naloxone, for instance, to your future career, or you can demonstrate specific domain knowledge. So again, with that opioid practice question we just did, you could talk about maybe cell biology and cellular mechanisms of opioid addiction and how they build tolerance. That is how you could go beyond there. And lastly, you can explain why. So a lot of times in panels, they ask you, okay, how would you solve this problem? How could you do this? And I know a lot of my friends, at least, they come up with the coolest ideas. Oh, I'd make an app. We should create an app. We should create a website for this. We should use virtual reality to address this. But they never explain why. Well, why is virtual reality the best solution to this problem? And this guy here, Smart Alec, this is relevant to this bolded point, and I really want to make this bold. Everyone knows Smart Alec. This is the person, guy or gal in your class, who will just speak condescendingly to people, but they always speak like they know everything. In reality, they don't know much, if at all. But these people, believe it or not, and unfortunately, they make it very far in these interviews because they can look at a camera and speak with confidence. So you, with your expert knowledge that you've actually developed, you're not talking a bunch of random stuff. Please build these skills so you can shine and your answers will get the attention they deserve. Now, lastly, how long should you speak? You can ask me more questions about this at the end as well, but generally, like for questions like, tell me about yourself, why do you want to be a doctor? These could come up first in a panel interview. And I've been hit with like the double whammy where they're like, tell me about yourself and why you want to be a doctor, right? So I had a 2.5-minute answer to each. This is like my longest answer realistically. 2.5 minutes if they ask me, tell me about yourself. And the way I talk about it is kind of where I grew up, what my family's like, my hobbies, and my passions. I might tie it into medicine a little bit, but not fully, because they could ask you a different question. Why do you want to be a doctor? And your answers should be separate for these two. 2.5, 3 minutes max, okay? And after that, I mean, you play it by ear, but I wouldn't talk for like more than a minute or two if they were to ask me a question. Sometimes my answer would be like a sentence. It really depends on the nature, and you can feel free to ask me about specific scenarios. And should you go in depth or broad, right? So these are panels, but it's not panels where they're like, oh, tell me about your family. No, it's panels where they are asking a lot of the times MMI style questions to you. It's just you have 3 people in your interview over Zoom. And my approach is I always go in depth on 1 or 2 topics, but I acknowledge other viewpoints I might have not talked about, either before I begin or at the very end, so they understand, okay, I'm not blind to these other possibilities. Again, feel free to ask me questions at the end about this as well, and tell who just joined, we will be sending you these slides, so don't be stressed that you're not taking them down. Let's do another practice question. How does the Ontario health system address the needs of Indigenous populations, and what improvements can be made? All right, spend a second to think about how you would answer this question. All right, let's look at this answer. Our introduction will say, the Ontario health system has made efforts to address the unique healthcare needs of Indigenous populations, though there are still significant areas for improvement. This is a beautiful first sentence because in a very subtle way, it's actually going to tell you how your answer is going to be organized. You're first going to talk about the efforts Ontario has made, and then you're going to talk about the areas for improvement. If you stray away from that, your interviewer is going to be like, they're going to be confused, right? They're expecting A and then B, but this is amazing. Now they can follow your answer. One way the system addresses these needs is through culturally sensitive care. This involves providing healthcare services that respect and incorporate Indigenous cultural practices, beliefs, and values. For example, some healthcare facilities in Ontario have integrated traditional healing practices alongside conventional medical treatments, recognizing the importance of holistic care that encompasses physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. This is beautiful because it tells you very indirectly. A lot of people like to force either the CanMeds roles or they like to force their extracurriculars into their answer, right? But this tells you, when you talk about healthcare facilities in Ontario having integrated traditional healing practices and then talking about spiritual well-being, you show that either you've been in the hospitals, you've seen these patients, or you've been part of like clubs at your school, community efforts. You have been in the system and you understand what are the needs of these individuals. It's not just about, oh, give me a drug and I'm good. Spiritual well-being is a huge part of different cultures, especially Indigenous cultures, and how they connect with medicine. The Ontario government has also made efforts to improve access to healthcare for Indigenous communities. This includes funding for programs and services specifically designed for Indigenous populations, such as the Aboriginal Health Access Centers, which offer a range of health and wellness services. Again, you're showing your knowledge. You're not just this interviewer who just started reading some books, on like beneficence and non-maleficence before you started. You understand specific things that Ontario is offering for this vulnerable population group. However, now you're going to get to the second part of your answer. There are still notable gaps and challenges. One major issue is the accessibility of services, especially for those in remote or rural Indigenous communities. These areas often lack adequate healthcare facilities and professionals, leading to the significant disparities in health outcomes. Another area for improvement is the training and education of healthcare professionals in Indigenous health. While some progress has been made, there's a need for more comprehensive and mandatory training on cultural competence and historical and social factors that impact the health of Indigenous people. Beautiful. Now we just talked about 2 areas of improvement. We talked about 2 things Ontario's doing, and we're not being wishy-washy. Oh, Ontario probably has, some interpreters. No, we're talking about specific things, and then we talk about 2 areas of that could be improved. And again, this shows that you've been in the medical system in Ontario and you understand what the weak points are in serving this vulnerable population. And look at this. Furthermore, there's a need for greater involvement of Indigenous communities in the planning and delivery of healthcare services. Now we're going to go to a solution. This is where we start going beyond. This can be achieved through more meaningful partnerships and collaboration with Indigenous leaders and organizations, ensuring that healthcare initiatives are community-driven and responsive to their specific needs. Not only did you address the question, okay, what is Ontario doing? What improvements can be made? But you're giving them more. Here is a way we can make that improvement. I'm just not going to list a bunch of problems. Anyone can list a bunch of problems with the healthcare system. I'm going to give you a solution. Let's get Indigenous community leaders in the decision-making rooms so they can tell us how to best meet the needs of their population and their communities. That is what you're saying right here. It's a very mature, in fact, this incorporates the CanMed role of shared decision making. But note that we didn't like force it into our answer. We didn't just say like, oh, I'm going to engage in shared decision making. You could say that. I mean, you're going to sound like a robot, but you could say that and it'll still get the point across. But we're very subtly and beautifully, we've shown our values and how they align with the CanMed's items just through the sheer maturity in our answer. And then finally, there's a conclusion given. Okay, and again, the strong points are we demonstrate relevant knowledge of Ontario policies, we have a multifaceted way of addressing the topic, and we show innovative ideas. Let's see how we could have gone beyond. You know, there's a lot of ways we could go beyond. You can, again, we're sending these slides, you look at them for yourself, you know, increase investment in healthcare infrastructure in remote Indigenous communities, telehealth, right? A lot of these individuals, if they have an emergency, they got to be like helicoptered out because they're like 2 hours away from the nearest hospital. Obviously, there's red flags to avoid. Don't overlook the historical context of Indigenous health disparities, including the impact of colonization in residential schools. This is another thing you could have talked about to go beyond. Colonization, forced sterilizations, residential schools, and trauma. All these things can cause mistrust in the medical system. So there's a lot of ideas that you can say beyond simply answering the question, which everyone does. Everyone answers the question. Everyone answers the question actually very well. Because you all got, you know, you're part of the 10% who are being interviewed. Everyone knows how to answer this question very well. It's up to you to find these ways to go beyond. All right, now we're going to the last part of the presentation. Told you to be quick. First impressions. So these really matter. Now, in synchronous interviews, which is what you're doing, always smile, introduce yourself. Hello, my name is Kevin. With whom do I have the pleasure of speaking with? I always ask that. And I thought it was corny, but it's really not. Even if their name's on the screen, they might have a name that you don't want to mispronounce. Get their name. Maybe they want you to address them by their first name. Smile, introduce yourself. With whom do I have the pleasure of speaking with? I would use that all the time. Looking back, it's a very mature way of getting someone's name. And remember their name, especially if you don't see their name. It's not like a Zoom thing where you see their name. Sometimes it just says interviewer A, interviewer B. Remember their name and say it at the end. Thank you, Dr. Locke, for your time. Very easy ways to stand out just by being personable. Now, personal questions, it's a panel interview. You're bound to get asked a lot of personal questions, especially when it's, you know, you might be asked a policy question and then they'll follow up with a personal question. So what I would do is look at the CanMeds roles and have 2 to 3 stories for each of these CanMeds roles. This is the American systems. I like this list, but just pick a list, honestly. 2 to 3 stories for communication, cultural competency, and so on. Because you could get a question like, what's the biggest challenge you've overcome? I've gotten this question in so many interviews. So many interviews have asked me a variation of this question. Name a time you overcame a challenge. What are your biggest, what skills do you draw upon to overcome difficult situations? The same question could be asked to you in a variety of different ways, and you can go back to these same stories that you have. Now, how do you answer questions like this? I like to use the STAR method. STAR, situation, task, action, result. So for instance, last semester in the McMaster Biosociety, while organizing a programming skills workshop for first-year students, we encountered an unexpected vendor cancellation, leaving us without crucial materials. I was tasked with swiftly finding a replacement vendor without overshooting our budget. Beautiful. S&T out of the way. Why do I highlight that? You don't get any points for S&T. I know so many people, and even me the first time I interviewed, I would spend like a minute describing the situation, right? Like the professor was doing this and they had a meeting on Tuesday, which they couldn't go to, and I had to do this. They don't care. You could tell them I was in the prime minister's office curing cancer. What gets you your points is the A and the R. It's your actions, which show your problem-solving skills, shows your values, your skills, and it hits those CanMeds items, of course. And the result, right? What happened? So let's look. Consequently, I quickly researched alternative suppliers, assessed their offerings against our needs, and strategically approached the most promising ones to renegotiate terms suitable for our budget. I used strategies like calling suppliers instead of email to ensure rapid Communication. Ultimately, we secured the necessary materials under budget, and the workshop went on without a hitch, earning praise from attendees. But here's the thing. The STAR method, a lot of people may know the STAR method, but it's missing a letter, the T. I think I made this up. Like, I think I invented this, but if I haven't, you can let me know. And the T stands for takeaway. So where possible, in these personal stories, you can go beyond everybody else just by having a takeaway. What was your takeaway? Let's look at this. As I pursue a career in medicine, okay, we're going to say the same answer, not the end. As I pursue a career in medicine, I will continue to draw on such skills to stay collected in rapidly changing situations. Through strong communication skills, along with problem solving, I will continue to ensure team needs are met for the benefit of my future patients. This is a phenomenal takeaway because it shows that you've reflected on what it means to be in medicine. You're going to be in teams that are going to be multidisciplinary. You're going to have to overcome conflict. It's a very mature addition to your answer that shows these skills that you've highlighted, right? The skills that you've highlighted in your personal story applied to medicine. And the beauty is these takeaways, you can have, I would have like one for all the CanMeds items. If I was asked the question about like communication, I would mention, oh yeah, like as a medical student or in my as a future physician, I'm going to be in multidisciplinary teams with a lot of perspectives, providing team-based care, holistic care to my patients. And I'm going to have to be able to like resolve conflicts and be able to communicate well within my team. I would have a takeaway for every single type of question that I could be asked, just in case I could use it somewhere. And it's kind of like free points, a mature takeaway that shows your value. So have personal stories, especially for your panel interviews, ready for all of the CanMeds items that reflect your values. Okay, you need to craft them. You need to craft them so they're short and sweet, and you can deliver them without having to think on your toes. Okay, you're going to be asked the question, name a time you disagreed with a supervisor. And you're going to be like, damn, like I didn't think of that. Name a time, disagreeing with a supervisor. You can't be thinking on your feet. So look through all the sort of personal questions you could be asked and have stories for them. Make them relate to your values, your future career, CanMeds. And here's the thing, the medical school. No one does this, but I did this. No one does this because I interviewed with the US schools. And in the US, there's over 150 medical schools here. And if you're a top applicant, you're going to apply to 30 schools, get interviews at 20 schools, and get into 10 schools, okay? I don't mean to ruin your night, but it's the truth. It's the truth with the American system, especially if you're a citizen, which I wasn't. I'm here as an international. But the schools want to know, well, why do you want to come to my medical school, right? If you're a top applicant, why do you want to come here? Because they don't just want to hand out acceptances all silly-willy. They want to build their class with reassurance. No one in Canada, you're lucky to get a single interview. You're lucky to get a single acceptance, right? I have been asked, though, in Canadian interviews, why do you want to come to the school? But only once across the 6 interviews I did total. Only once have I been asked, why do you want to come to this medical school? So usually you're not asked, but always have an answer to this, especially because you could be asked cool questions and research your medical school very well. Research Western, all the departments it has. Go on the Schulich School of Dentistry and Medicine, click all the tabs, find out what global health opportunities they have, find out what clinical rotation sites they have. Maybe they go to rural places, right? So if you're asked a question about maybe indigenous populations or rural health, you can say, you know what? This is why this is why I'm really interested in attending Western, because I know you have these rural rotation sites where I can do 4 weeks in my 4th year and learn about the problems that these communities face, okay? Research your school, know like everything about it, because you never know. Like, for example, I had an interview, it asked about like antibiotic resistance, some question about antibiotic resistance, and I was like, you know what? Your school, I'm not going to say which one, right? NDAs or whatever. Your school has one of the premier antimicrobial resistance laboratories in the nation. And I would love to contribute to that research as a medical student. So it really helped me stand beyond. Everyone was just answering the question, but I had this connection specifically to the medical school. So please research the medical schools and try to integrate, maybe if you can, into your personal stories. All right, last pro tips, organization. This is about letting your amazing answers get the recognition that they deserve. So in the first sentence or two, especially if they're asked about, a big policy question in your panel or a big, personal question, you could say, I'll begin by addressing the pros and cons of implementing such a public health policy before giving my opinion and then relating to an experience I've had in the area. So now the three people that are interviewing you know exactly how to follow your answer. They probably asked that same thing to the past 6, 7 people they've interviewed across a few days. And now you're already standing out because you're telling them, okay, this is how I'm going to organize my answer. It's going to make it easier. And then you're going to say, I'm going to relate it to an experience I've had in the area. So not only are you going to give them an answer, you're going to stand out by making that personal experience. And of course, first impressions are critical. Avoid extreme stances. Now, this often, people think this is, oh, I don't need to be told this. This is obvious. But you could be asked a weird question like, should pharmaceutical companies be allowed to provide gifts, such as free samples of their latest medicinal compounds to physicians? Now, most applicants, I guarantee you, most interviewees are going to be like, no, this is a conflict of interest. Oh, no, pharmaceutical companies, bad, right? They're bad people. Oh, this is a super conflict of interest. The physician's going to be biased, and so on. But imagine, because we live in Ontario. Ontario provides Medicare, which is free healthcare at point of service, but we don't have pharmacare, which means our drugs are not free. You have to, if you want antibiotics, you're going to pay for those, unless you're under your parents' insurance with their employer, or maybe you're employed, or there's certain government programs as well. We don't have pharmacare. What if this pharmaceutical company gave drugs, medications, and you have patients that could benefit from those drugs, and maybe they can't afford them? Boom, now you can give it to them for free, right? What if it's a medication that would be really helpful, and you're just being like, you don't want to be open-minded, and you're not going to even consider it, but it really could help some of your patients with chronic conditions. Furthermore, what if this pharmaceutical company, if there's a law, they can't do this, and now they can't market, and they go bankrupt? Maybe they're a big part of the local economy. Maybe, they hire people, obviously, so now a bunch of people are going to be laid off. They have families to feed, right? And obviously those medications aren't random. They serve a purpose. They help people treat their conditions or manage their conditions. So always, even if someone seems super evil, even if something seems like a super conflict of interest, at least consider the other perspective, and don't just spend 1 second, but spend a good little bit of time delving deep, just as I did, into the evil person's perspective. And that will really show your maturity in your answers, okay? Study before you sleep. This is a personal tip. I read this book when I was a teenager. It was called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens. And it said, whatever you do 45 minutes before you go to bed gets replayed in your head up to 6 times more than anything else you did that day. Now, I don't know how true that number is, but I find it to be correct, because if you go on the news before you go to bed, and it's like, oh, this person got murdered, this person got shot, there was a robbery here, you're going to have bad sleep. If you watch a horror movie before you go to bed, you're going to have nightmares, right? So I would always practice for my panels and my MMIs right before I went to sleep. So the perspective-taking mindset, all the personal stories would become ingrained in my brain, and they wouldn't be something I memorized to repeat. Oh, what was that personal story? Okay, I'm going to repeat it now. No, it would become part of my way of talking and thinking, and these stories would just come naturally to me. Also, I told you I'd show you how to stand out. So the second time I didn't bother with like CMAG or White Coat, Black Art, or Doing Right. I didn't use those resources at all that other people did. They're not bad resources. They're probably phenomenal resources. But I was like, how am I going to stand out? I started reading things like Nature Biotech, the MIT Tech Review, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Stanford Future Everything podcast. I'd just go to the gym and listen to all these cool podcasts on a very big, diverse amount of viewpoints. So, and it really helped my answers, right? What do you think about AI and its future in healthcare? Everyone is just saying the boring, like, ethical concerns of AI thing that you can probably read on healthydebate.ca, right? It's not wrong, but is that really like the extent of your thinking? Oh, we have to make sure AI is not biased. Cool. You sound like you sound like GPT. Like, people literally sound like GPT in their interviews. I would talk about AI medicine. I talk about like, cyber war, cyber crimes. For example, Toronto or Ontario, several health systems were completely with ransomware, completely paralyzed last summer because of ransomware, right? So now if you have hackers using AI in healthcare, you can completely lock down health systems. So really interesting viewpoints that you can't get by reading the same stuff as everybody else. Please go do yourself a service as a human and read cool new things. Don't just copy everybody else. Then you're going to sound like GPT. You're going to sound like everybody else. So I would have all these opinions, AI applied to genomics, right? You can analyze your genome and find polymorphisms that are relevant to diseases. So a lot of cool things I talked about that I guarantee you, I probably taught them a thing or two during that interview. This is depending on your platform, you might want to zoom out. Okay, share videos of answers with colleagues. So this is something I did, especially before all my panels. Let me just show you what I mean by this. So this is our website, and we have question banks on Casper, especially the medical school MI, or just a general interview, traditional interview. And you can go here, and especially for Western, you look at the personal questions up here. If you want to practice, only thinking about a question for like 30 seconds, and then having like a minute to answer, you can create a test, and it'll ask you a question, right? Should physicians and other healthcare professionals be allowed to strike? This is a question you could be asked in your panels, in your MIs, in anything. And then you can begin your answer, talk to the camera, finish, save the video, share with your friends. And I would do this to see what is my presence like on camera, because like I said, it is critical that you have this amazing presence, and then you can again review the expert answers. And I used to go beyond the example answers with reflex avoid and check out, other people leave comments. A lot of questions, especially how would your mother describe you? I've been asked this variations of this so many times. What are 3 words you'd use to describe yourself? How would your mother describe you? How would your friends describe you? Especially for panel interviews, right? So practice talking to the camera, and then look at what an example answer would look like and how you can really stand out, okay? Like, for example, you could mention a potential weakness, right? And this may even make you come across more human. Most people are going to not mention a weakness, but if you can find an expert way to integrate some sort of weakness, you're gonna stand out just through your personability. And again, there are a lot of topics that you need to not only understand, have some insight on, know the facts on, especially in Ontario, in Canada, but also be able to deliver an expert opinion on, okay? So take this list, I'm gonna send you these slides, and spend some time with it. I wanna highlight, we have not only our main question bank, and by the way, the answer I just said, like who's the most important person on the healthcare team, all these questions are in our main question bank. And we have mini question banks on the opioid crisis, on Ontario health policy, like we just looked at, AI in healthcare, social determinants of health, US health policy. This is huge. I'll tell you why this is huge. Because I did an exchange in the US. So every time they asked me some sort of question that would have something to do with, like, should Canada do this? I'd say, okay, yeah, here's my opinion. I'd give a nice answer, and I'd probably stand out as well, like I showed you the ways to do that. And then I'd say, but here's what the US is doing, right? We shouldn't do this because this has already been done in the US, in this state. Or this is what the Bismarck system in Germany is doing. Or this is what the NHS in England's doing. Or this is what Singapore is doing. And I actually, because I took courses on global health systems, was able to give these profound answers. What should Ontario do? Man, I could tell you what like 6 different places in the world are doing, and that would help me stand out. Again, I'm basically teaching my interviewer in the middle of my interview. They're learning from me as I tell them these things. So if you can have understandings of how different healthcare systems deal with their issue, it can really make you stand out. So I would spend a lot of time just skimming through how the US does things and what are their weaknesses and strengths. Alberta, a lot, understand other provinces in Canada, that can be very relevant. Telehealth, alternative medicine, huge. British Columbia, genetic testing, CRISPR, vaccine ethics, mental health. and so much more. So we have done a lot of research to provide example answers. Like you saw, specific things that are relevant today, real-time answers to things going on in Ontario, in Canada, across the world today. And we've integrated them into these expert answer formats, along with ideas to go beyond and avoid for every question, okay? And right after this webinar, we will be sending you a subscription credit. A very nice one, actually. So look for that. It'll come with the slides. And that is it. Like I said, 45 minutes. Does anybody have any questions for me?